Welcome to the podcast of World Literature Today, your passport to great reading. I'm your host, Sonja Srinivasan. Each episode brings you highlights from the latest issue of World Literature Today magazine, which is currently celebrating its 100th year of continuous publication. On today's episode, we'll feature an interview with writer, professor, publisher, and man of letters Ilan Stavans. A reading by poet and Kundiman founder Joseph O. Legaspi, 3 book reviews, and for those of you who are trivia buffs, a quiz. The 2026 Pewter Ball Lit Fest took place at the University of Oklahoma on April 2nd and 3rd, headlined by Pewter Ball Fellow Hala Liza Ghafouri. The event included Persian cultural events with music, book signings, poetry, and more. Past fellows have included writers such as Orhan Pamuk and Jenny Erpenbeck. The festival is a living tribute to the late J.G. Pewterbaugh, an Oklahoma philanthropist, entrepreneur, and civic leader who loved poetry and believed it to be a source of cultural enlightenment and a means for understanding other cultures from around the world. Hope you can attend next year. More at pewterbaughfestival.org. That's PUTERBAUGH festival.org. Looking for a good read? How about A Compass on the Navigable Sea, an anthology celebrating 100 years of world literature, edited by Daniel Simon with a foreword by Pico Iyer. Visit restlessbooks.com to learn more. And now, here's my edited interview with the Restless Books publisher and co-founder. Ilan Stavans was born in Mexico City in a multilingual environment. He immigrated to New York in the mid-'80s. An essayist, scholar, translator, linguist, and many other things, he's the co-founder and publisher of Restless Books, an independent nonprofit publishing house devoted to contemporary literature and translation, and to immigrant writing worldwide. He's also the Lewis Sebring Professor of Humanities, Latin American and Latino Culture at Amherst College, a fellow at the New York Public Library, and a consultant to the Oxford English Dictionary. His work, translated into many languages, has been adapted into film, TV, theater, and radio. Welcome, Professor Stavans. It's nice to have you on the program today.
It's a pleasure and an honor. Thank you for having me.
And I feel like this bio doesn't really do justice to all of the different things that you work on and do. Your translations have featured in World Literature Today, and you do areas of work and research in everything from translation to sociolinguistics, lexicography, Spanglish, Jewish literature, especially Sephardic Jewish literature.
Yeah, it is a short life, the one that we are given, and never know really how short. And one has many passions, and one has to fit those passions in this short life. At least that is the mantra or the philosophy that I have.
That's well said. Life is very short, and there's so many literary projects, and I always feel like so many good books, so little time. And speaking of good books, you are the co-founder and publisher of Restless Books, if I understand correctly.
Yeah, exactly. It's a publishing house that started, it's going to be 15 years in 2027 next year. It's a small independent nonprofit based both in Brooklyn and in Amherst, Massachusetts, where the 2 places where I live now. And it is devoted to, as you mentioned at the beginning, immigrant literature from around the world. This is a time of immense challenges to the status of immigrants in different parts of the globe as a result of the war on them by populists, nationalists, governments. The hope of Restless is to publish memoirs and short stories and novels that immigrants write in different languages and that come to us eventually in English translation to understand what it means to move from one place to another. And the vast majority of people in the world are actually either themselves transient individuals that were born in one place and make their home somewhere else, or that descend from immigrants like that. And then the other aspect of a Restless is to give a space to great literature from all over in many languages that, for a variety of reasons, mostly commercial but also political, don't make it into the English language.
Yes, and it's ironic. A couple weeks ago I just finished Otni Air's Land of Love and Ruins. She's a wonderful Icelandic writer, and I looked at the back of the book, and it was published by Restless Books. And more recently, Restless has published the World Literature Today anthology that's out just now, and it's called A Compass on the Navigable Sea. The foreword is by Pico Iyer, who is an incredibly global writer, and it's edited by World Literature Today's own Daniel Simon, who is one of our editors. And it seems to me that Restless Books is kind of the press version of World Literature Today. Can you talk to us a little bit more about the global ethos of your press? Because you mentioned that you work on two different areas, both the immigrant literatures as well as literature and translation. Could you talk to us a little bit more about this?
With pleasure, and I thank you, Sonia, for this question. And I hope it's the one that really justifies this wonderful engagement, this wonderful conversation that we're having. We're very proud at Restless of publishing the anthology of the 100th anniversary of World Literature Today.
And it's a wonderful book. I feel like a kid in a candy shop every time I pick it up, and I
It's
don't know where to start.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's wonderful because Daniel Simon's scope is so broad, and that is also the scope of the world literature today. There are poems and short stories and letters and speeches and all kinds of literary gifts and jewels that come from many different languages and from many geographical landscapes. And the anthology deliberately doesn't want to segregate any of them into everything that is coming from Asia or everything that is coming in the form of a poem. The world is messy, the world is disorganized, or let us say, the world is beautifully organized in its disorganized fashion. And the anthology, I believe, tries to do justice to that spontaneity, kind of accidental approach that literature truly has.
Absolutely. And that's so well said, that the pieces are gifts and jewels, and how they're not segregated by either culture or genre. And that's true. I think often as readers, we're going to read one thing and then another. Like I mentioned, I just finished Otni Air's Land of Love and Ruins. And right now I'm reading Kiran Desai's The Loneliness of Sonia and Sunny, which are two completely different books, but
Right.
both very enjoyable. And in,
Absolutely. I
yeah,
think maybe one could say that the best editor is the reader, and that all readers are editors just by virtue of choosing whatever is going to be in front of them in a bookstore, in a library. We are already building an anthology of selections, and then the anthologist tries to replicate that approach in suggesting that there's a map that could be followed. It's only a suggestion. Ultimately, the reader might obviate or ignore certain pieces in the anthology and go to others. One of the beauties of an anthology is that it is not read from the first page to the last, but it is read haphazardly and in a very passionate way, depending on the fancy of the reader. The reader sets the tone.
I wanted to mention that you have an essay in this anthology, which again is titled A Compass on the Navigable Sea, 100 Years of World Literature. And your essay is titled, Is American Literature Parochial? And it raises the fundamental question of if American literature and writers are unaware of writers and literature overseas. But you argue that even some of the greatest Nobel laureates themselves are quote unquote provincial, writing about a very particular area that they know, a very particular community or place that they've lived in their whole life or grown up in or live in now. And you assert that a writer's true country is the language in which he or she writes or they write. So, could you talk a little bit about the relationship between American literature and literature overseas? Because it's
Yes,
certainly a fraught topic. Um,
absolutely.
Many people have mentioned that American literature does tend to be insular, and yet, at the same time, we are a huge multi ethnic, multilingual, multicultural, multi religious, multi everything nation that produces writers of all backgrounds. So, there are a lot of very complex questions and tensions that come up with this topic. Could you talk a little bit more about this?
Absolutely. And in framing and phrasing your question the way you just did, Sonia, I think the gist of my worldview and the answer that I give in the form of an essay is already embedded. There is a tension in the United States between being absolutely global, and by global, I could also use synonyms like imperial or international, or thinking that anywhere and at any point, somebody somewhere is going to be reading and speaking and engaging with the English language.
And those are very interesting concepts about American literature being both imperial, but as well as very global and international and read all over the world.
And on the other hand, you have the fact, as you mentioned, that this country is made of immigrants. And so it is a microcosm within the boundaries, within the what this country is from one coast to another, north and south with Canada and Mexico, that we contain multitudes, the way Whitman would put it. We have
Yes.
all the languages in the world here. So we are incredibly international, incredibly global within, and yet outside we expect others to go to the English language as a result or as a strategy or as an instrument in order to understand who we are. And we are lazy or apathetic about learning other languages. And that moves into the next stage. We think that everybody will translate our literature into their language. And it's true that American literature is translated in France in a way that German literature is not, or Italian literature. American literature gets many more translations
Yes.
in most of those countries.
Yes, and I was astonished even once many years ago when I was in Italy in a supermarket and there was a small shelf of books right next to the freezer section, next to the frozen vegetables, that even had a book by Orhan Pamuk, which just astonished me, to see that in a grocery store, which says something about
Exactly.
how well people are read overseas or reading authors of different languages and cultures compared to here in the US. And in your essay in the anthology here, you talk about how the place of literature in the United States is vanishing. Could you comment
Mhm.
on that? Because sometimes it seems like there's more writers in the United States. The
Yeah.
competition is more fierce to get published. There are lots of journals and magazines popping up online. But yet, at the same time, there's always this concern or fear.
It's a crucial question and a decisive one. On the one hand, we have the rise of a widespread literacy. Never as today have more people been able to have access to information, being able to read and write and offer their opinions. With this comes the technology of disseminating one's own views on social media, on the internet. Many, many more people read. But the question is, what are we all reading? How long is our attention span? And to what degree is literature as we have known it for millennia
Yes.
still capable of offering insight and complexity to the human experience? One reads a novel like War and Peace or A Hundred Years of Solitude or Madame Bovary as a journey into another time and another space, in most more than anything else, into the interior of another character. That requires a kind of surrendering of our own sensibility and a commitment to try to understand fully how this character, Madame Bovary or a Coronel Aureliano Buendía, behave, because ultimately that's what the writers are trying to tell us. And my great fear is that while more people read, less people read literature, while more people have access to information, the role of the novel and of the short story and of the poem is being reduced in terms of the population that reads it. But let's also not be foolish. Literature from the beginning of time has been the purview of a small group that keeps it alive and pushes it to the next generation. And so it might be that we feel very nostalgic for a time that was different, but even in the past, even when more people were reading, the numbers were small.
We'll be back with more of Ilan Stavans after this. Ready to test your knowledge of world literature? Here's a brief 3-question quiz. Number 1. Albanians comprise a majority in which other country? A. Kosovo, B. Slovenia, or C. Greece? Number 2. Poet Arthur Z holds which prestigious position? A. Minister of Culture, B. Poet Laureate of the United States, or C. Professor at Harvard University? And number 3. The Dutch word uitweeën translates roughly to what expression in English? A. Writing poetry, B. Get some fresh air, or C. Baking bread? Answers coming up later in the podcast. And now, back to our interview with Ilan Stavans. Digitally, we have so many things for people to read, even podcasts like this for people to listen to, but it seems like a lot of people don't want to pick up a book or sit for a long time with a book.
Yep, absolutely.
And yet we still have long books that do get published. We have anthologies like this one. And it's quite an extensive, massive tome, which Daniel Simon edited. And you yourself are not a stranger to anthologies. So you've published this one, but you've also edited the Norton Anthology of Latino Literature. And I was curious about the challenges and the joys of putting an anthology together, because how do you decide what you leave out or what you put in? Are there things you really wish you could put in, but for what reasons did you decide not to leave a piece in?
Yeah, it's made of very difficult questions, but to me, very interesting, provoking, and ultimately satisfying questions that deserve an answer. I am convinced that an anthology is a portable library. It is a way for the editor to say, these are representative pieces that, when seen as a galaxy of entities, communicate with one another, might have a sun or two or more centers of gravity around which they rotate.
Well, it's a great analogy.
You don't really put everything in the galaxy. You only offer a map of that galaxy or a bookshelf of that galaxy, with a hope that the reader will get a taste of what that poet is, but through the poem that you selected, or the short story, or the essay, or the speech, and that will lead the reader to discover those traditions or those authors in more completely. I think there are two main questions, Sonia. On the one hand, is the editor the right person to putting together this anthology? Will the reader trust that editor as the guiding reader to navigate with this compass, this particular part of the sea, as invoking the title of Daniel Simon's anthology? Or will the reader get impatient with the editor and think that the reader has better solutions or better proposals? But even in the second option, what you want is an active reader, a reader that will say, "This is great, but I had already read a piece by Pamuk, or I had already read a piece by Emily Dickinson," and I can see that another perspective is being offered here. So the other part that I was mentioning is that, in my view, an anthology always creates its double. It is the book with everything that went in, and
Hmm.
automatically and magically, perhaps, you also create the book with everything that was left out. The world itself is that other book.
You yourself work with many different bodies of literature that I mentioned at the beginning, and sometimes there's overlap. So, some of the major areas that you work in are Jewish literature, Latin American literature, translations.
Mhm.
So, could you talk a little bit about each of these areas you've worked in and where you see the overlap?
Beautiful question. Sonia, let me, if you and the listener have not reached this conclusion, maybe let me make the statement at this point. I am by definition or by nature a skeptic. I
Really? How
am
so?
always I'm always questioning the values and concepts and principles that have been given to us, the ones that my parents gave me and my teachers. And I'm hoping whenever I'm in the classroom that my students will not take what I say at face value, but will also put a question mark. Is this true, and
That's
why
excellent
so?
pedagogy.
And they should have doubt as the leading force as they travel through whatever argument they are going to make. So I believe that we have inherited, for a variety of reasons, literary traditions, Mexican literature, Jewish literature, literature that is always in translation, and is those categories are both helpful and entirely artificial. I think Mexican literature so happens to be Mexican because the writers were born at a particular
Hmm.
place in a particular time. But there are many writers in Mexico that have rebelled against the stereotypes, the cliches, the
Yes.
principles, the views of being Mexican, and that it could be writing in English, or could be writing in French and in other languages, or might be writing in Spanglish. So what most interests me are the writers in a tradition that are uncomfortable and challenging that tradition. What
Uh-huh.
putting a big question mark. And that happens with Jewish literature probably more than any other, because Jewish literature doesn't have a geography. It can be written in
Right.
any language. It can be written in different times. It can belong to so-called different traditions. You could be a Jewish Italian writer, or a Jewish Romanian writer, or a Jewish Israeli writer. And
Yes.
that means that your view of the world will depend on the language and on the motifs of that tradition. But then you can break away from that.
Yes, and that's true because if I think about, for example, Jewish writers, three that pop into my head who are so different or are Amos Oz,
Mhm.
Natalia Ginsburg, who's an Italian Jewish writer, and even Isaac Bashevis Singer. I mean,
Right.
three very, very different writers. And it,
Absolutely different.
yeah,
One is an Italian, as you said. The other one writes in Hebrew. The third one writes in Yiddish. The tension between Yiddish and Hebrew was very intense for a period of time. Natalia Ginsburg didn't believe in religion, whereas Bashevis Singer was the child of a rabbi who
yes,
himself couldn't get a permanent job. And Amos Oz is a part of that first generation of Israelis after the state of Israel that sees his vision in a very national and even nationalistic, although he might not like that term, way. So there's many ways to be Mexican. There's many ways to be Jewish. There's many ways to be American. And
mhm.
what is interesting is not the center board, but the edges of that tradition.
This is so fascinating because it all raises a question about how legitimate is it to lump together a diverse group of writers into a body or a category? Because on the one hand, it seems inevitable. As human beings, we're always categorizing things. But on the other hand, you have so much diversity even within a category, like we were just
Right.
talking about. So I suppose how it's done is the key. And like you were saying, you're interested in figures that often are challenging
Right.
these particular stereotypes or molds, or maybe don't fit the center of the the
Right.
group.
To me, Sonia, this is both a philosophical and an artistic discussion. Artistic because writers ultimately want to be themselves, want to be unique,
Yes.
want to be different. They want to maybe recognize the influence that the previous generations or their contemporaries have on them, but they want to establish their own parameters, leave their own legacy in a way that is unlike that of anybody else. We think old novelists from the United States, in some ways, are going to be like Hawthorne or like Toni Morrison or like John Updike. And then what is interesting is to see how different the new generation will be vis-a-vis those ancestors and how ultimately their successors are going to also rebel against them. So it's always a tension, maybe because of that background that I have, multilingual. It is easier to think that I belong to the Spanish language or to the Yiddish language or to the English language, which is an adopted language for me, than the fact that I was born in Mexico. That feels to me more accidental.
I see.
It's language ultimately that injects in us a certain worldview that will be carried on in every single word and in the spaces between words as we shape whatever we write and give it to others.
I hate to end this discussion because it's so fascinating, but I fear we must wrap up. Thank you so, so much. And this has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. Again, Professor Ilan Stavans is the co-founder of Restless Books that has published World Literature Today's new anthology called A Compass on the Navigable Sea, edited by Daniel Simon. And we hope you will get to explore this anthology as well as many of the works by Professor Stavans. Thank you. And now, a poetry reading by Joseph O. Legaspi, who's the author of the collections Amphibian, Threshold, and Imago, and the chapbooks Postcards, Aviary, Bestiary, and Subways. He works at Columbia University, teaches at Fordham University, and resides in Queens, New York. He is also the co-founder of Kundiman, a nonprofit organization dedicated to writers and readers of Asian American literature.
Hello, my name is Joseph O. Legaspi, and I'm reading my poem Aurora Frog from the March-April 2026 issue of World Literature Today. Aurora Frog. We're disembodied, Aurora, my mother of northern light, and I, echoing through our landlines in the Western Hemisphere. She muffles over the Bruce Peach twilight ether about what ails her, the litany of acquaintances' recent deaths, distant family gossip, how she despises old age like Cher. What is a diva to do in the crumbling? I sonar the outline of her in front of the television, cathode ray tube radiating the voice, vastness of suburban culture under the California firmament. What ails her most is loneliness, she says, sunken in the middle of the indigo sectional, the size of its own country. Time collapses there, and I'm reminded of New Zealand and the Aurora frog, an extinct species discovered in a cave by which it was named. Vanish as soon as people shored on Te Anau Fiordland, South Island. I picture the frog with obsidian eyes like my mother's, terrestrial amphibian, poor jumper, no vocal sac nor tympanums, but with a snout and a vestigial tail of its tadpole attributes. In her darkened living room, drips of faucet water resonant from the kitchen, my mother ponders her shuddering end, nearer and nearer, cloistered in her hypochondriac cavern. How to fathom the enormity and smallness? When a mother passes, does a son cease to be a son? Childless, lavender, dun poet. It's as if an entire genus lifts into air, and before vanishing, a twinkle in the twist of the naming. Aurora is the dwelling. I am the frog.
One of the highlights of World Literature Today's magazine is many books in review. Today, I'll feature 3. Lopamudra Basu of the University of Wisconsin Stout reviews Salman Rushdie's The 11th Hour, a quintet of stories. Salman Rushdie has authored 15 novels in his long literary career spanning more than 5 decades. His first collection of short stories was East-West in 1994. The present collection, The 11th Hour, subtitled A Quintet of Stories, is his second short fiction collection. The quintet offers Rushdie the opportunity to experiment with several distinct prose styles, ranging from social or documentary realism to genres like magical realism and the Gothic. In many ways, the exuberance of these dramatically different prose styles is reminiscent of the Rushdie of the 1980s, and takes readers back to the classics of his oeuvre, Midnight's Children, Shame, and the Satanic Verses. One of the stories, which is the second in the collection, is entitled The Musician of Kahani. It is set in Rushdie's beloved Bombay, in the neighborhood of his childhood, which surfaces in his novel Midnight's Children. In this particular story, Rushdie's satirical commentary is directed at India's emerging billionaire class, and their media shenanigans orchestrated by endless celebrations of personal events like weddings that showcase the world's richest and most famous as guests. This collection, dwelling on mellower themes of mortality and aging, dazzles with the same savage satire and literary erudition that characterized his works from the previous century. Don Schofield of Thessaloniki, Greece, reviews Adrian Kolfopoulou's The Re in Refuge, published by Red Hen Press. A Greek-American writer and professor based in Athens, Kolfopoulou offers a sensitive, wide-ranging meditation on displacement and belonging, her own as well as that of others, as she chronicles over a decade of working with refugee communities in Greece. Her volunteer work becomes a form of political witness, demonstrating alternative approaches to refugee support outside official frameworks. Serving alongside other volunteers, including poet A.E. Stallings and translator Karen Emmerich, she participates in art projects and poetry workshops that recognize refugees as complex human beings rather than merely aid recipients. Workshops become spaces of mutual learning where traditional helper-helped hierarchies dissolve. Taken together, her essays make a convincing argument that refuge is not, quote, simply a place but a practice, unquote, one that acknowledges both difference and common ground, mutual vulnerability, and the recognition of shared humanity. And finally, Taylor Nassim Stone of Indiana University reviews the editor Holly Mason Badra's book, Sleeping in the Courtyard, Contemporary Kurdish Writers in Diaspora, published by the University of Arkansas Press. There is nothing simple about explaining who Kurds are and what struggles they've survived. Furthermore, Kurdish literature has not historically been easily accessed in the English language. Badra makes excellent use of the introduction to briefly acquaint the reader with Kurds and explain her methodology for building this collection. Here, Badra shares that the heartbeat of the anthology is togetherness, and that, in accomplishing such a goal, quote, this collection resists confinement, unquote. Thus, producing a publication of mixed media, poetry, graphic novel, prose excerpts, memoir, to allow diaspora Kurds the unbridled freedom to express themselves rather than curating ideas for serving a monolith of Kurdish identity often built by those of non-Kurdish identities. One does not need to be Kurdish to connect with the raw human experience captured in its pages. As promised, here are the answers to the quiz. Number 1. Albanians comprise a majority in Kosovo. Number 2. Poet Arthur Z is Poet Laureate of the United States. And number 3. The Dutch word uitwaaien translates roughly to get some fresh air. The World Literature Today podcast can be found on all your favorite platforms, where you can like and subscribe or follow us. It is produced by Sonja Srinivasan in cooperation with World Literature Today's editors, Michelle Johnson, Daniel Simon, and Rob Vollmar, with support from R.C. Davis-Undiano, Executive Director. Recording assistance provided by Ryan N. Wilcox of Groundworks Media Lab. Additional assistance by Kirsten Johnson and by the VoiceOver Alchemy Group. Special thanks to Christopher Kaiser, Steve Kemsley, Jed Kim, Lisa McCullough, Catherine Olson-Carter, Golfo Silos Wernet, and Susie Vuljevich. Original music by the Global Ensemble Agau Dilim in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Based at the University of Oklahoma in Norman, the magazine is published 6 times a year in print and online. You can read and subscribe at worldlit.org, where you'll find new pieces added weekly. We hope you'll join us for the next episode. In the meantime, please visit worldlit.org and follow @WorldLitToday on Instagram, Blue Sky, and Facebook for the latest updates from the fascinating world of contemporary international literature.